Hi everyone, in this video we're going to talk a little bit about summary and paraphrase. Now, we're talking in terms of they say, I say over the entire course of the semester. Your book is they say, I say. I'm going to be driving it into your head that you're wanting to respond to what other people say. Now, obviously, this means that you're going to have to actually reference what other people say. There's a few means of getting other people's words into your paper and other people's ideas. Those means are summary and paraphrase, which we'll talk about in this lesson, and quoting, which we'll talk about in another lesson. So when it comes to summary and paraphrase, we first of all need to make sure we know what we're actually talking about. So let's define these terms. First of all, summary. We've all used that word before. We all know basically what it means, but we want to think about it in terms of what it means when we're discussing bringing people's voices into our paper. So a summary is really like a broad restatement of somebody's main ideas. You're taking all of their big ideas and condensing it into something smaller, and you're keeping it in your own voice. So if you look at something like Mount Everest, you could spend all day talking about Mount Everest. You could talk about the height. You could talk about the temperature and the weather patterns that happen on the mountain. You could talk about the number of people that have climbed it, the number of people that have died trying to climb it. You could physically describe it. Can physically describe this picture. You can say whatever you want about Mount Everest, but when it comes down to it, what is it? Well, it's a mountain. So if you wanted to summarize what is Mount Everest, it's a big mountain. It's the biggest mountain in the world. Whatever you want to say, you're taking this very, very broad thing and condensing it into something simple, and you're doing it in your own voice. So if, for example, somebody were to write 3, 4, 5 pages of text and you only needed to take the main idea from it, that would be a good time to switch it over, to just summarize, switch it to your own voice, and just get the main idea and not focus on the details. So you'll notice that I'm saying my own voice instead of my own words. This is a deliberate thing that I'm doing. The first secret word is dragon. When you say put it in your own words, I think it kind of tempts you to just think about manipulating words, taking somebody else's words, moving them around a little bit, and then saying that they're your own. That's not really your own words. What you want to do is speak in your own voice. Say it the way you would say it. You want your paper to sound like it's actually they say, I say, the way you would say something. So make sure that you're always writing in your own voice when you're responding to these people. And when you're summarizing or paraphrasing their points of view, use your own voice as well. Now, we talked about summary. Paraphrase is basically another type of summary, but it's a little bit more specific. We said summary was useful when you wanted the main idea but you didn't want the details. Paraphrase is useful when you do need the details but you don't want to actually quote them. You don't want to use what they've said word for word, but you do need all the information. So if we look at these two pictures, here we've got a house with some red and some white and some plants growing outside and stuff like that. Well, here we've got another house with some red and some white and some plants growing outside. You could think of this house as a paraphrase of the first one, but the author has put his own twist on it. He's put it in his own voice, basically. So you're taking the ideas, the details from the other one, and you're restating them in your own voice. So a paraphrase, a detailed restatement of an author's ideas in your own voice. Again, if details are important, but the words themselves are not useful enough to actually quote, that's when you paraphrase. If details are not so important, but the main idea is important, that's when you summarize. Now, you need to make sure you avoid the paraphrase trap. What a lot of people end up doing when they start paraphrasing is they find a really good passage, they've got their book, and they're like, oh, I like this passage, but I don't want to quote it. I'm going to paraphrase. So they start looking through it, and they're like, well, he says it's. Maybe I'll say it is instead. And then he says sleepy. Maybe I'll say tired. Well, that's not really your own voice. That's just kind of mixing and matching your words with theirs. And it really might end up being plagiarism. Here we see the original Eiffel Tower. Here we see another Eiffel Tower that's built in Vegas. If you were to try to claim that this was your own because it's somewhere else and made out of different materials, that would be plagiarism. You really need to make it your own voice. It would need to be your own tower, even if it's following the original design. Now, don't forget, when you summarize and paraphrase, these may be in your voice, but they're not your ideas. So you still need to give credit to the author for the ideas. That's where we'll use signal phrases, sometimes parenthetical citations, other means of getting giving credit to the author who originally stated the words. So moving on to a system that you can use to avoid falling into this plagiarism trap. I like to think, when I'm paraphrasing, as though I'm just explaining something to one of my friends. Before you can do that, you have to make sure that you understand the actual topic inside and out. So read the paragraph or whatever it is that you're planning to paraphrase a few times until you've really got it, and then explain it to your friend. These two people, they're just having a conversation. I don't know why they're on a railroad track, but that's irrelevant. They're just talking to each other. Say she's explaining this movie she saw recently. She doesn't need to watch the movie. She doesn't need to go word for word and go through and switch the words around to make them her own. She's just going to tell it in her own voice the way she remembers it. Do the same thing, and that way you'll avoid the temptation to just move words around and fall into the plagiarism trap. Now, when we come to chapter 2 of They Say, I Say, they've got some good advice for us too. The first one is this idea of putting yourself in the author's shoes. So you need to play what Peter Elbow calls the believing game. The key here is that when you summarize and paraphrase, you need to be fair to the author. You don't want to show a whole lot of bias or argue against somebody when you're just presenting somebody's views. So say, for example, you are a pro-life person and you're presenting the view of somebody who is pro-choice. Well, it would not be appropriate for you to say, now, this guy thinks it's perfectly fine to murder innocent babies. He obviously doesn't think it's perfectly fine to murder innocent babies. He probably thinks it's appropriate for a woman to have the choice in what's going to happen to her body. So when you take his words and twist them into something that's not fair to him, that is not playing the believing game, not putting yourself in their shoes. So when you summarize or paraphrase, imagine that you share their point of view. Summarize them fairly, the way that they would like to be summarized. Later you can go in and argue against them and tell them all the reasons they're wrong. But when you're presenting their point of view as a summary or paraphrase, be fair to them. Second of all, make sure you know why you're summarizing and paraphrasing. Where are you going with this? So to do that, you summarize with your point in mind. What am I trying to accomplish by bringing in these ideas into my paper? With your upcoming paper, the They Say paper, you ought to be summarizing and paraphrasing to provide examples of ethos, pathos, and logos, to show us who the audience is, or to give an example of what the person's purpose is. You need to make sure you know what you're trying to accomplish so that you summarize and paraphrase the right stuff. The second secret word of the day is sword. If you don't summarize with your point in mind, you might end up summarizing things that are really irrelevant to what you're trying to do, and that's why when we end up with list summaries, which are incredibly, incredibly boring. A list summary is when you're like, and then he says this, and then he says this, and then he says this. And those are really lame. It's basically like a book report, and you don't write book reports in college, you write them in 5th grade. So avoid list summaries. Make sure you have your purpose in mind when you're summarizing. Last thing that They Say, I Say says that's really useful is to use signal verbs, and they actually go so far as to provide you a list on pages 39 and 40. So if you want to look along on that page, you've got all these different verbs that you can use to introduce summaries and paraphrases, and also to introduce quotes, which we'll talk about in the next lesson. And it actually breaks them down as to what you're trying to accomplish by bringing this paraphrase or summary in. So if you're saying that your author is making a claim, you could say he argues, he believes, he emphasizes, he observes. If he is expressing agreement, you could say he acknowledges, he admires, he praises, and so on. There's 2 full pages of potential verbs that you can use. Not only does this make sure that you give credit, it's much more interesting and much more precise than just saying he said, he said, he said, or saying according to, according to. Think about what the author is actually doing, why you're bringing this information into your paper, and then think about which verb best expresses what he's trying to do. Choose from the list, and it's going to give your paper that extra precision, that extra little bit of liveliness that's going to make it a better read. All right, that's all for this lesson. If you have any questions, just let me know.